Do you find that 2025 will be the year of BRICS? Russia having this initiative, both in Ukraine, they've been thrown at 20,000 plus sanctions and have been able to withstand it. China, despite all the claims that they are falling and collapsing, the economy in China is stable and seems to be rising. And these two countries are getting closer and closer together. Indonesia, Nigeria is now a partner country of BRICS. BRICS keeps on growing, and Russia and China seem to be getting stronger and stronger. So why would they be afraid of these threats by Donald Trump? And do you see this year as being a year for BRICS where we see even more momentum go this way toward multipolarity?
Absolutely, yes. Simple answer to your question. Next question. No, I'm joking. I mean, it's been the year of BRICS. You could say 2024 was the year of BRICS. Okay. As of January 2025, there are now 10 members of BRICS and 9 partners. The full members of BRICS are, of course, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. The 9 BRICS partners, which are on the path to full membership in the near future, are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. There are 3 other countries that were invited to become a partner of BRICS that have not officially given an answer, and I think they will some of them will probably join BRICS in the near future, especially Algeria is one of them. Vietnam might, but Vietnam is playing a kind of complicated geopolitical game. I understand their position. They don't want to invite too much backlash from the United States, which could hurt them. They don't want to be seen as being too firmly in the China camp. So they're trying to balance their relations with the US and China to serve their own interests, which, it's benefiting Vietnam. It's one of the fastest growing economies. It's not getting enough attention. It's really industrializing very well, moving up the value chain. And then Turkey is the other country that was invited to be a partner. Who knows what Turkey will do? Turkey is one of those countries that no one can ever rely on. So BRICS continues to expand. I expect, basically, I think every year or two, there will be more countries invited to become partners of BRICS. Okay, currently, with the 19 members and partners, it already represents the majority of the world population. 54.6%, nearly 55% of the world population is represented by BRICS countries. This also includes 42.2% of global GDP when measured at purchasing power parity. Okay, that means that the 2 most populous countries on Earth are in BRICS, India and China. The 3rd most populous country is the US. The 4th most is it's Indonesia, which is now a member of BRICS. Throw in Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa. Throw in the 2nd most populous country in Africa, Ethiopia, which is now also in BRICS. So throw in Egypt as well. So you have the largest economies in Africa, the most populous countries in Africa are in BRICS. Africa is the fastest growing continent in terms of population. There are estimates that by the end of the 21st century, by 2100, 38%, nearly 40% of the global population will be in Africa. Africa is literally the future of the world. This is a continent where there are many countries with very fast growing economies. And they really want to industrialize, and they really want to develop better infrastructure. And what's also good for the environment is that many of these countries in Africa are going straight to an electrical grid based on solar panels. China is the world's leading producer of solar panels. Solar panels have become the cheapest form of energy, by the way, of electricity production, even cheaper than creating a coal-fired power plant. It's now, in terms of total wattage, it's become cheaper to install solar panels. And that's especially good for some countries in Africa that don't have a very good infrastructure. And they're to the extent that they have an electrical grid, it's very decentralized. There are still a lot of rural areas that aren't connected to the electrical grid. So if they can connect solar panels, it's much more decentralized. It's much better to kickstart industrialization in these countries, because Obviously, the most important thing you need if you want to develop and industrialize your country is you need electricity. If you don't have electricity, you can't develop. So China is providing low-cost technology that is needed for these countries to develop. It's complete win-win. It's a no-brainer. China also is helping to, it's, of course, this benefits China as well. It's what they refer to as mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. China now, because there's this idea in the West, which is false, that Chinese workers are on starvation wages. No one can afford anything. It's not true at all. If you look at average manufacturing wages in China, they've increased by over 10 times. I mean, they're actually much higher than in other parts of Southeast Asia. In fact, if you look at, obviously Japan and South Korea are a different case, but if you take out South Korea and Japan and you look at East Asia and Southeast Asia as a whole, China has the highest wages. Higher than Indonesia, higher than Vietnam. And even in Vietnam, they've also massively increased in recent years, much higher than in the Philippines. So as we were talking about earlier, China's manufacturing is not so insanely competitive because of low wages. It's because all the supply chain is local, because the infrastructure and energy and telecommunications and transportation is all run by state-owned enterprises, which can, because they're not looking for profit, they can reduce the costs of these services to as low as possible. It's because China has very well-developed technical workers who are very productive. It's because China has automated and robotized, used a lot of robots in much of this manufacturing. However, the very low-end manufacturing, that is becoming expensive in China. So instead, a lot of that low-end manufacturing is going to other countries. It's been going to Vietnam, to Indonesia, and it's been going to many parts of Africa, to Ethiopia, to South Africa. So what we're seeing is this process by which these countries in BRICS are also technologically developing and industrializing and following a path similar to the path that China followed. And with Chinese support, they're also being able to follow in the footsteps that China went in. So BRICS is essentially becoming this kind of new, I wouldn't call it like a new economic, I should be careful about the words I use here, because we shouldn't call it an economic bloc, because BRICS itself says we are not a bloc. China says we do not want a bloc mentality. They're not trying to divide the world up into blocks. It's the US that is dividing the world up into blocks through sanctions and tariffs and saying, you either go along with us or you're against us. This is the George Bush's mentality. So BRICS is providing the economic infrastructure for these countries to pursue alternative paths of development. And financially, this is very important because the most important thing that BRICS can do is to create an alternative to the US dollar-denominated financial system. Because one of the biggest advantages, one of the biggest weapons the US still has is its control over the financial system. It's trying to kick countries out of the financial system if the US doesn't like their political or economic models. This is what the US did to Venezuela, to Cuba, to Iran, to Russia. So the US, by expanding its use of sanctions and tariffs and sanctioning more and more countries, tariffing more and more countries, it's pushing more and more countries to seek alternatives, and BRICS is providing the alternative, the beginning of those alternatives. I think we're very much still in the early stages of seeing what those alternatives will be, but they will come out of BRICS. So yeah, this, to answer your question fundamentally, I think this year is the year of BRICS. 2024 was the year of BRICS. 2023 was the year of BRICS, and it's going to continue growing. And the reason it's going to continue growing is because so many countries want an alternative. This is not new. You can go back, 2024 was the 50th anniversary of a call for the new international economic order, which was made by the formerly colonized countries of the global south when they were seeking to decolonize the financial system. They had already gotten independence formally from European colonialism politically on paper, but as Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of Ghana, the anti-colonial leader, socialist and co-founder of the non-aligned movement. As he famously said, neo-colonialism had replaced classical formal colonialism. And what was the difference? Formal colonialism was political colonialism. Neo-colonialism was economic colonialism. This is why so many countries wanted a new international economic order. Every year since then, the G77 plus China has reiterated its call for a new international economic order, and BRICS is providing the potential institutional support for creating that new international economic order. It's still very much in the early stages, but it's absolutely going to accelerate its development over time.
Tariffs already proven to backfire on the United States. Sanctions backfired quite dramatically, especially with regard to Russia, and have backfired in isolating the United States further from the world. While China and Russia has strengthened its global position quite dramatically, Donald Trump came in, and to give him some credit, he's calling himself a peacemaker. He's not saying, I want to invade this, I want to topple that. But even his threats and belligerence around economic war already have all of this proof of not only not working, but also creating what is actually a boomerang effect that does the opposite of what he even says he wants to do, right? American decline is over. This is the golden age. Well, it's not over. It seems like these policies are likely to do the exact opposite of creating a quote unquote golden age.
Yeah, a few thoughts. First of all, yeah, Trump claimed in his inauguration speech he'll be a peacemaker, but this is basically what every president says. I mean, there aren't, even George Bush didn't go out and say, yeah, I'm going to wage war everywhere. I hate peace. They all claim to support peace, but then they say, oh, we have to wage this war on behalf of peace, right? I mean, that's what they always say. So in the case of Trump, in his same speech, in his inauguration speech, he said, I'm not going to wage war. And then he said, we're going to take over the Panama Canal in complete violation of the sovereignty of Panama, which has said that it's not for sale. He hinted very clearly at colonizing Greenland, which has also said they don't want to be colonized by the US. They want independence from Danish colonialism, to be independent. They don't want to replace Danish colonialism with US colonialism. And then in his speech, he also invoked manifest destiny, which is the colonial doctrine that was invoked by the US colonialists in the 19th century as they ethnically cleansed indigenous peoples and stole their land. So, I mean, saying that he's going to be a peacemaker is one thing, but then in the same time, he threatens Panama. He claims that China controls the Panama Canal, which is completely false, but it's part of this, manufacturing of consent to justify military intervention in Panama and to also fearmonger and demonize China. And in a press conference, Trump was asked if he would rule out the use of military force to take over the Panama Canal and Greenland. And he said, no, I'm not going to rule that out. So now he's indirectly threatening to invade the Panama Canal, invade Panama, and invade Greenland. He's also threatening to invade Mexico. In his speech, Trump announced that he's going to declare cartels as terrorist organizations, and he's going to send U.S. troops to the southern border. And he also hinted at sending in special operations forces in Mexico, which would be a violation of the sovereignty of Mexico. It would be an invasion of Mexico, because the Mexican sovereign government has said that they do not support the U.S. sending troops into Mexico. Okay, so there's all of that element. Then we already talked about fear-mongering about China, threatening Iran. Let's not forget Trump killed Qasem Soleimani, and there are a lot of warmongers and neocons in Trump's administration, including Marco Rubio, who were salivating over the possibility of a war in Iran. And they think this could be the moment because, they've decimated Gaza, they've done damage to, although not destroyed, Hezbollah, and they think that Iran is weak, they think, which would be another disaster, but it would also be a disaster for Iran. So finally, getting back to this question about, tariffs and what can Trump do. Again, I think this is all bluster. It's all part of his strategy of trying to threaten other countries to force them to sign a deal. He thinks that it's that simple. He thinks that the U.S. is as powerful today as it was in the 80s and 90s. It is not. A lot of people around the world can see that the U.S. is significantly in decline. And he thinks that the U.S. has all this leverage. like I was talking about earlier, the US really has 2 points of leverage. One, it has a very big market for consumption. So yes, tariffs can be used to say, okay, you're not going to get access to the big US market, but there are other growing markets, including China, 1.4 billion people, including India, 1.4 billion people. I mean, the US market is still important, but over time, it's less and less so. Okay. And then the other threat he has is the military. And yes, the US military is still very powerful. That's a major threat. The US spends more on its military than the next 9 largest military spenders in the world combined, or the rest of the world combined after them.
Right.
However, just because you spend a lot of money doesn't mean that you're spending it productively. We know that a lot of the spending in the US, which is over $1 trillion, the official military budget is almost 900 billion. But in reality, there are economists who point out that if you factor in, for instance, veteran spending, because veteran spending is not included in the military budget, if you factor in nuclear weapons spending, which is under the Department of Energy, if you factor in other things related to transportation that's used, infrastructure used by the Pentagon, in reality, the US military budget is well over $1.5 trillion and growing every year. But a lot of that spending is completely unproductive. It's basically corporate, it's basically government handouts to big corporations, to the military industrial complex, to the Beltway bandits, these big contractors, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. You know, the stock prices of the military industrial complex have actually grown faster than the S&P 500 as a whole. So if you've invested in the military industrial complex, you've gotten very wealthy. So they benefited from it. But does it actually mean that the US military has this technology that actually works, that it's good? Look at the F-35. I mean, the US spends billions and billions of dollars on some of this technology that doesn't even work, but it benefits the military industrial complex. So what we're seeing in Ukraine is the result of that. The US has given Ukraine at least tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons. There are some people who estimate over $100 billion worth of weapons and military assistance and other assistance. And Ukraine is losing badly. All of NATO has been supporting Ukraine, flooding Ukraine with weapons with the most advanced technology, and Ukraine is losing badly against Russia. So do they think that they can take on China and Russia? I mean, at some point, when you drink your own Kool-Aid, it becomes even dangerous for you as well. So I think Trump can continue the bluster, continue the threats, but at the end of the day, what it's going to show is that the U.S. is actually not as powerful as a lot of people think it is. And the real danger, the last note I'll say is what the real danger is this pushing, when push comes to shove, if this becomes World War III or some kind of nuclear conflict or whatever, that's the real danger, of course. And the U.S. thinks that it could win that war, but it would be devastated in the process as well. And no one wins a nuclear war. Everyone loses. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, that's why I'm glad you brought up the Trump belligerence and chest thumping and militarist, dog whistling around pivoting back to the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine, adding in Greenland, Canada, that's nice red meat for his base, especially, who believes that expansionism in Canada is this ultra liberal state that needs to be incorporated into the
Colonized.
U.S. colony. Yep, into the U.S. colony.
One really brief note I forgot to mention. You mentioned the word expansion in his inauguration speech. Trump used that same word. He said, "We are going to expand our territory."
U.S.
That
territory.
is literal imperial expansionism. It's textbook imperial expansionism.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up because in many ways, Ben, I see that as one, of course, dangerous, and there could be, of course, new war threats emerging, and especially for those countries in Latin America, which seriously do not need any more militarist intervention in their lives. Very much so a danger, but at the same time, it almost smells like a pivot that indicates defeat, the weakness in some ways, because I've been thinking about this. I've been like, well, the United States empire cannot do it all. It cannot try to weaken Russia, defeat Russia strategically, as the Pentagon says, contain China, break up multipolarity, and then repivot back to the Western Hemisphere and extend out as far as it can into Latin America and send military forces to Greenland to establish independence. All of this feels very, dare I say, unrealistic. Not to say that it can't happen, but to say that there might be limits to this overreach that this kind of smells like, and in some ways it feels like a reorientation of empire rather than any kind of, as Trump would call it, a shift toward peace.
Well, a few thoughts. We were talking about how the U.S. is in decline in some serious ways. I think that's obvious. However, what happens when a significant power is in decline? They often lash out. What happens when a bully feels threatened? They try to target weak people. And that's what really concerns me. You know, the U.S. Trump can have all this bluster and bravado about China and Russia. He knows that the U.S. cannot take on China and Russia. And I do think that there will be some kind of end to the proxy war in Ukraine. I was saying that even if Kamala Harris won, I thought there was going to be some kind of end because Ukraine is losing badly, NATO is losing badly. Now, the question is what it will look like. Maybe Trump does get some kind of deal in which Russia maintains control over the Donbass and Crimea and Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO. Europe would not accept that. They would not sign that deal. So maybe it just becomes a frozen conflict like the Korean War and there's no formal end to it. It's just a cessation of hostilities. Who knows? I do think that Trump actually does want to end that conflict, to focus more on countering China. I don't think in the next few years, I hope I'm right, I don't think there will be some kind of US-China war. It would just be absolutely crazy and catastrophic. China has made it as clear as possible they do not want a war. They do not want a proxy war. Of course, the economic war in China will continue. The tech war in China will continue. That's totally bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. However, what my real concern is that Trump and the neocons around him, like Marco Rubio in particular, they're going to be focusing on solidifying U.S. imperial control over Latin America, over the Western Hemisphere as a whole. And that's what all this is leading to, right? And the U.S. already has at least one military base. There are different numbers go around, but at least one big U.S. military base on Greenland. Trump can just say, okay, we're going to colonize Greenland. The U.S. military is going to take over Greenland. And Greenland doesn't have a local military that could defend them. So, I mean, that's a very real possibility. And that's something that would be very scary because it's just blatant 19th century style colonialism. He's talking about militarily invading Mexico. That's another very serious concern. Marco Rubio being picked as Secretary of State, I think, is a very clear sign that a big priority is going to be trying to colonize essentially Latin America, to reassert imperial control over Latin America. When Trump was president the first time, Bolivia was targeted in a US-backed coup that overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales. And then Elon Musk famously said, we will coup whoever we want. Elon Musk he has an office in the White House. He's a senior member of the Trump administration. They're saying we want to colonize Latin America. It belongs to us. They're invoking the Monroe Doctrine. They're invoking manifest destiny. And what concerns me is that, again, if you're a big bully, you're going to go after weaker people who can't defend themselves. China and Russia can defend themselves. Latin America cannot defend itself against the U.S. military. The U.S. military is by far the most powerful military in the Western Hemisphere. So that's what really concerns me. When Trump was president the first time in 2020, Marco Rubio asked Trump to invade Venezuela. And if you read Mark Esper's book, I published a video and an article about this at geopoliticaleconomy.com. Mark Esper, who was Trump's defense secretary, he wrote in his memoir that Trump repeatedly asked about the possibility of an invasion of Venezuela. He asked if it was militarily feasible. Now, Russia did send some planes to Venezuela as a sign of support and as a sign to the U.S. that they shouldn't, invade Venezuela. But if the U.S. invades Venezuela, I don't think, symbolically, Russia provided that, but I don't think Russia is going to militarily intervene to help Venezuela. So that's what really concerns me, is that the U.S. is just going to go full-on colonialist. The U.S. has always been imperialist in Latin America, organizing coups and regime change operations. The Biden administration did it. The Obama administration did it. But if they just go full-on 19th century style colonialist and say, we're just going to take over, we're going to take over the Panama Canal, send troops. It was in 1989 when the U.S. also, it was Ronald Reagan who, and then going into later, George Bush 1 invaded Panama and overthrew the Panamanian government and arrested the Panamanian leader, Manuel Noriega. So, there's a precedent here. If they just invade Panama, there's talk of invading Venezuela. There's talk of invading Cuba. And with Marco Rubio, not only would he not oppose that, he would be strongly cheerleading for all of those policies. And he will be every day in Trump's ear whispering about, hey, we should take over Venezuela. Trump said it. He said in a rally in North Carolina at a GOP Republican Party event, he said, when I was president, we came so close to taking over Venezuela. We could have taken it over, he said. And then he said we could have taken its oil. But it's not just about the oil. He said we could have taken over Venezuela. This is just straight up colonialism. And the Biden administration recognized this ridiculous puppet, Edmundo Gonzalez, as the supposed president of Venezuela. He's not the president. Nicolás Maduro is the only real president of Venezuela. And Edmundo Gonzalez, he's tweeting from Washington. He just tweeted, today is January 23rd. He tweeted yesterday, I'm in Washington. The weather is really cold, but I'm working hard. What? You're not working hard. You're just waiting for the U.S. to overthrow Maduro so you can be put in as a puppet on their behalf so you can follow orders from the State Department. So that's my real concern. And that's what keeps me up at night, is that I think we're going to see an explosion. It's not new. It's bipartisan, but we're going to see a massive escalation of U.S. meddling and colonialism in Latin America. And the real targets are going to be Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and also Mexico and Panama now. But Mexico, I really think that Trump is going to send troops into Mexico. It's going to basically be an invasion. Now he'll say, they're just special operations forces. They're not, tens of thousands of troops. But it's still an invasion because the sovereign government of Mexico has said, you cannot send troops here. We are a sovereign country. Do not militarily intervene. And then, what they're going to try to do to Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, that really keeps me up at night.